Okay, welcome back everyone to our second lecture of the week, and what's going to be a continuation of the lecture Professor Van Glipson started on Tuesday, which will transition into a kind of more exploratory group activity on the second half. But to begin with, Margot and I, Professor Van Glipson and I, are going to be kind of finishing off and talking about a few other ways to think about how this notion of justice as fairness that we explored in Tuesday's lecture has become instantiated into the datafied world, how it's become part of institutions, how it links up with algorithmic ways of thinking and algorithmic structures for dispensing and doing justice. So we'll talk about a few examples of that. I'll start with one example. Professor Van Glipson will then jump in and talk about another approach to thinking about this issue before we jump into a more participatory collective activity around thinking about the kind of more expansive meanings of justice in and with data. Okay, so with that, I'm going to talk about something I'm excited to talk about. I haven't actually presented on this case before, but it's a case that I've worked with and actually with the student team, the human context and ethics student team for some time. In fact, it's a case study that was originally discovered by a former student team lead in human contexts and ethics. So I'm really excited to sort of share it, and I'll need to go and tell that student who's since graduated and gone off to grad school that we're actually, presenting this now as part of Data 4. And it's also part of a homework that's now getting integrated into Data 100. What is this case study? It's another case. This is a case about algorithmic justice, and that version of algorithmic justice is fairness. And it focuses on the case around the Cook County Assessor's Office. Now, Cook County is basically Chicago, Illinois, and some of its surrounding metropolitan area. Kind of the various townships, places like Evanston, Illinois, are all part of it. It's a really big, massive area that it's covered. And what it's about is a little story that's taken place over the last 10 years or so, dealing with how this bureaucratic organization does what it does, which is to assess property values, all kinds, both commercial and residential, but we'll be talking primarily about residential today, assessing property values in order to determine property taxes. At the center of this very practice, of course, is an issue that is related to the distributive justice, to issues of equity and equality that we were talking about on Tuesday. And of course, the language of fairness is central to this concern with distribution. So how to best distribute, in this case, not goods, but burdens, how to distribute tax burdens in an equitable way. So there's constant appeals by everyone involved in this case that we're going to look at, one in which there's different ways of imagining and actually institutionalizing and deploying distributive fairness. So everybody appeals to fairness and equity, but what it actually means to build a system that performs this in practice varies quite widely. But all around, one of the things that I want you to start to see is how the very notion of fair distribution lends itself particularly well to algorithmic forms of thinking, involving the kind of optimal allocation of resources, or in this case, burdens, in large and complex real life situations where, for example, you're looking at Cook County, which has millions of properties in it. So algorithmic fairness in all these cases where it's a complex distributional issue is put forth as a means of not only dealing with the complexity of the case, but creating an impartial, so again, a word that we really associate with fair legal systems, impartial, objective systems that supposedly are immune to being biased by subjective intervention, or as means of circumventing the corruption that often takes place in large-scale social and political systems when they get too personal or personalistic. So this is going to be an example of how an approach to algorithmic thinking has been, and to algorithmic justice, has been put into action to solve a problem of unequal distribution of tax burdens. So the story begins, well, technically the story really begins 10 years ago, but I'm going to begin with the story that came out as published by a series of articles published by the Chicago Tribune in 2017 that recognized that because of actually a lawsuit that had been already opened up against the Cook County assessor of the time, Joseph Barrios, that had basically accused him and his office of creating a deeply regressive, that is, system. And regressive here meaning that it plays disproportionate burden on those of lower income brackets or those whose property values were lower than those who are wealthy. And so there was a whole investigation into this done by the Chicago Tribune, which partnered with the School of Public Policy at University of Chicago to basically analyze the data and come to a determination both of, is this the case, to what degree is this the case that there's a regressive system, what's causing it, and how do you actually create and then fix the problem and create a sort of more equitable or just solution. What they found, of course, was precisely that this was taking place, that those residents in working class neighborhoods were more likely to receive property tax bills that assumed their homes were worth more than their true market value. So again, if say your house is worth, you sell your house for $200,000, or your neighbor does who has an identical house sells it for $200,000, but you're being assessed on a house that's $300,000, you're effectively being taxed more than you should be according to this system. Whereas the opposite was the case in wealthier and mostly white communities, where their houses, although worth more, technically, like they have more equity, on the housing market, they could sell their houses for more, were systematically being valued at, when it came to taxes, at less than their, quote unquote, fair market price. And so had a lower and disproportionately lower tax bracket. Okay, so the Tribune stepped in, compiled and analyzed more than 100 million property tax records from 2003 to 2015, and worked with University of Chicago to sort of see this. And I want to show you a couple graphs that they ended up producing that showed this. So there's actually two parts of this issue of data and justice that I'm talking about. One's going to have to do with the creation of a system to deal with this. The other is the use of data to pursue justice, in this case, to visualize and represent before a public the injustice taking place in a particular locality. And so the efforts, the journalistic efforts of the Tribune, the work of academics, the work of community activists who had helped bring these lawsuits up in the first place, in part reached a wide public and affected the outcome of the election of the next Cook County assessor, in part because of the persuasive case they were able to make using these various data analyses to demonstrate the lack of equity in the prior system. So on the left are a couple graphs of very specific measures of inequality, basically. I'm not going to go into the technical details at all because I'm not sure I totally understand them of what coefficient of dispersion means precisely in this case, but it is a common metric for assessing disparities in housing assessment that's put out as part of this international set of standards for housing assessment. And basically the graphs, both coefficient of dispersion, price-related differential, basically just show that looking at this data, that housing prices or housing assessments across time were, for one, severely affected by the recession of 2008, which is part of what created the spike, but never actually got back into what was considered an acceptable range by the International Association of Assessment Officers, which sets these standards for what counts as being an equitable range of dispersion. Basically, measures of the accuracy of how close, the assessed value to the actual sale price, say if the property was sold, within the next year after something being assessed, how close those were. And these are two different ways of measuring that difference. Another graph on the right shows, the degree to which income in particular would affect one's marginal, effective tax rate. And so you can see that those with lower household incomes, median household incomes, were effectively taxed at a noticeably, measurably higher rate than those with higher income, median household incomes. Because of the racial nature of income disparity in Chicago and racial segregation that maps highly onto class differences in the Cook County area, this meant something really specific for racial disparities. In essence, that the more white you were, the more likely you were to have the value of your home be underassessed. So another chart demonstrating the racial disparity. One more chart to show you. And again, we'll put the slides up so you can take a closer look at these later and analyze exactly what each of them means as a visualization of injustice. But here in this case, this one that breaks down the percent of properties that were assessed at least, overassessed by at least 20% according to, by race of census tract. And so you can see that whites were overassessed far less than African Americans or Hispanic populations. So why was this the case? How did this come about? So there was part of the discrepancy did have to do with the actual algorithmic models being used. There were faulty, regressive, in part overly simplistic models for actually trying to predict these prices. And I'll briefly touch on that in a moment and how they tried to address it. But a big part of the problem was structural to the very social system that was bureaucratic system, in essence, that was constructed to actually carry out and dispense justice in the form of these tax assessments and tax burdens. So what it turned out, and what these graphs help you start to get a sense for, is that it was the appeals process, in fact, the appeals process where people who had their home assessed could go before a review board and challenge their assessment and say that I don't think this is fair. And in fact, there's a whole industry of tax attorneys in Cook County who make their livelihoods off of helping people who can pay them go before the review board and reduce their tax burden. And so what these graphs in part show is on the left side, both that, well, actually, in each case, there are different images demonstrating how the appeals process, which, by the way, increased over time under the county assessor's reign. So the number of appeals skyrocketed from the mid-2000s until 2015. But also that the people who actually were able to appeal their assessment were predominantly upper class and therefore also predominantly white. And so here's a kind of geographic representation on the right of homeowners who appealed, and you can see that it's those closest to the lake, and those are the wealthiest neighborhoods. And then you can also see, by contrast, on the next side, the number of years homes were overvalued. And that there's a kind of clear correlation between these two maps, that exactly those places who are able to afford tax lawyers, able to take the time to go before and actually appeal their assessment and get them reduced, were precisely those whose homes were relatively undervalued, and those who don't have those kind of resources were not able to challenge those assessments. So pause for a second. Any questions about what I've said so far?
I have a question, Professor.
Yeah.
I posted it in the chat. These graphs that you've been showing made me think of two things. First one I asked in the chat is how do these type of conversations really come up? Because it seems like a lot of people wouldn't notice, oh, I'm paying more than the average, the average upper class person, because I don't know, it's like it feels like these type of issues, it's so broad that if you're looking at it from just as a single person, you don't notice it. So like it makes me wonder, how do these type of conversations come up in the first place?
Right. Very much from below, from people negatively affected. And what you would have is predominantly Black homeowners who recognized that they bought a house for, a price. The market then got worse during the recession, and yet the assessed value of their house kept going up. Or people who
Wow.
downsized from one house to another in a lower income neighborhood to try to save money on taxes ended up for that more inexpensive house, recognized that they were suddenly paying more taxes. And so there were people who were like really couldn't afford it, who were scraping by, didn't know what was going on. And so there was a class action lawsuit taken. I think with class action, I actually don't know the details, the particular history of the initial lawsuit, but the lawsuit itself, the lawsuit was part of what brought it to the attention of the Chicago Tribune. So there had been challenges. People had noticed, wait, this doesn't seem fair. The lawsuit itself went out and collected data. So I think in a slide that I have coming up in a moment, I have a few slides that are taken actually directly, that were produced by the lawyers working on this lawsuit.
And then the second question, I'm still like struggling to understand like how this is innately a racial
Mhm.
datification, because by my understanding this looks like it's kind of it's more the fact that the people are more reversing how the data is being used or being interpretive. So I don't see like I understand the ending how it becomes racial, but I don't understand how it initially it's like a racial idea.
The initial idea. So this isn't a great example of structural racism, because it's not about the county assessors in their minds being like, how do we go out and screw over Black people? That's not the point of it. The issue is that there's a structural issue, which is that Chicago already is highly segregated, has been. There's a whole history of redlining in Chicago that sets up these geographical disparities, such that neighborhoods and race map onto each other so highly. And then, of course, there's just the fact that class and race are so tightly matched together, such that it was a system in which if you are wealthy, you could more easily appeal your tax assessment. And so there was an element of corruption, not sort of overt racism of going out and saying like, let's overtax Black neighborhoods, so much as so the piece of the corruption which I didn't mention yet was that Berrios, actually the Cook County assessor across this period that I've talked about so far until just a few years ago, himself, and they're on the data's on another slide I was going to talk about, but he had close connections, had served on the board of review, and had a particularly close connection to the Property Tax Lawyers Association. So like his campaign, I think, was in part financed by them. So he was dependent in part upon the very people who made lots of money off of perpetuating this system. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it answers a lot. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So Daniel asked a question about the election. So I haven't quite gotten to the elections yet, but basically all of these stories and these graphics came out before an election in which Berrios lost and was replaced by someone else creating the system that I'm about to talk about in a moment. This was already being looked at before an election and informed the public before they went and actually voted in 2018 for a new county assessor. Okay. So on to our next slide. So this already starts talking about, the way that, how do I put this? Here's a few quotes from the county assessor and from his deputy assessor about the valuation, where they, saw that, oh, these numbers are going up. Oh, people are assessing, are challenging the process more and more, appealing, I should say, their assessments. And this was spun using a lot of the kinds of rhetoric that we'll see regularly throughout this class, appealing to community engagement, involvement, sort of anti-technocracy, humans in the loop, the idea we're appealing, the idea is fairness. We made the numbers, so this is a place where just the public can come and challenge, what these elites, bureaucrats are doing, and this is going to make things more fair. So as the deputy assessor said, appeals are a good thing. The goal here is fairness. We made the numbers, we can change them. there's an explicit appeal as well to the human, community engagement, and how the human element is essential to assessing property accurately in such a complicated and diverse community. As Barrios, I think the last quote for Ed, sorry, I didn't actually, it does say Barrios, yeah. These numbers represent the good our office does with these numbers appeals going up. Appeals give all communities a voice in the assessment process, and we reach out to them, of course. This turns out not to entirely be the case. This is something that ignores, and it's very similar, by the way, to the appeals to colorblind racism, to formal legal equality of opportunity. Anybody can come and challenge these assessments. But of course, that formal legal equality, anyone can, have a lawsuit, anyone can come and appeal, ignores the fact that there are deep material prerequisites to being able to do that, being able to take time off your job when you work multiple jobs and also have to take care of your children. When you don't have the money to pay for tax lawyers that can actually know how to game the system, how to work through the loopholes to lower your tax assessment. So it turns out that this appeal to the human, to fairness, to community engagement, things that we will be talking a lot about as themselves important principles for thinking about a extreme notion of, or not extreme, but a more robust notion of justice, are complex, because if they're not taken seriously, if they don't pay attention to material and structural inequalities, they end up becoming formal covers for continued discrimination. So again, I have one of the quotes up here, and this slide actually basically covers what I just explained, but has some of this written down. This problem with this idea, and one that we've seen and will see, about fairness as equal access, that anyone can appeal, but that, of course, and we see the map here. The map on the right really helps show us the way in which this these disparities are really powerful. So I had mentioned a moment ago, but I hadn't remembered the exact details. So I said that he had raised money from property tax attorneys. So apparently for the Cook County Democratic Party, he had raised more than $5 million since 2009, and more than half of it came from property tax attorneys and the businesses associated with them. So this was part of the accusation of corruption that was part of what was leveled against Barrios through these stories. Okay. So then comes the election, and a new assessor, Fritz Kagi, is put into a sort of gains control and tries to build a whole brand new system to try to solve and fix this problem of inequality. And the idea is a few different things. So first off, he sees himself as having this mandate, and I kind of put up a few quotes from Kagi from his early tenure that describe what he saw his mandate is trying to do to fix this. So again, appealing to some of the same rhetoric, but with different ideas how to implement it, to establish distributional equity in property taxation, which again means that properties of the same value are treated in the same way during assessments. So still a kind of formal equal treatment of each property. And then this invocation of a language that's very common to legal and bureaucratic standards, for centuries, that, or at least since the 19th century, that it has a duty to assess impartially and uniformly. So again, these are attributes, ways of qualifying of what fairness and justice mean. And the purpose, of course, and behind all of this, is to make the office also more accountable, not through the appeal system, of course, was meant to be one version of accountability, but this was a different version, a way in which property owners can come to know if they are being treated fairly and uniformly. So actually this was, to your question, Jasper, how do you notice this? Part of the idea and the mandate behind developing a new algorithmic tool for them was also to build a tool that could help people help the public come to know whether or not they were being treated fairly or not, and not rely upon the Chicago Tribune to kind of do this big story and create all these metrics. So ways in which the public could come to visualize in real time how they were being assessed, and to look at various metrics of equity in real time. So what the new assessor did was to create an office of data science. I think the first office of data science in a assessor's office in the country, headed by Rob Ross, who is part of that University of Chicago team that I mentioned earlier that had helped with the original Tribune story. And so what they looked to do was not only to create a more accurate algorithmic model, that is a model that would more accurately predict prices than the previous one, which was regressive, by the way, even before it it was corrupted by this particular appeal system. But they really thought about designing a new socio-technical system that is not just an algorithm, but a new set of relationships between the office and the wider public in order to try to repair these kinds of relationships. So what they did was to create this whole open data hub on GitLab, where they would publish all of its code, all of its data in this open source online platform for software development. And put this whole Cook County open data portal there on GitLab. And so the idea here, as they put it, was that this, and this is a quote from Rob Ross, who wrote this Medium article you can see here on the right, is this new system for publishing and updating code was supposed to allow journalists, academics, and the public to monitor our performance and even suggest changes to our methods that can improve our accuracy. Transparency in civic technology, as he put it, is a two-way street. So transparency where we show you and you can also help us improve the model. This was the basic idea behind this. Create this new system. And they just decided to use more sophisticated machine learning techniques in order to make these predictions than had been done before. So here's just a quick image of their GitLab that tries to show here is the whole system. Here's what the process looks like, where the data is, what steps it goes through, along with, again, as I said, all of the different data sources, the kinds of data. You can go and make your own visualizations on the GitLab, et cetera. The idea, again, is making the system and its data publicly accessible, the workflow, the codes, the standards, the data. Okay, so really briefly, and this isn't a class on machine learning, but it's something that we'll encounter occasionally through the course. So I should say a few notes about it and why this approach to doing mass appraisal, that is appraising houses, assessing their values en masse. So you can, every 3 years, every house in Chicago can be assessed in this way. Why machine learning and what does it do? So briefly, machine learning here was used to develop and test models that could predict the sale price. And the sale price is equivalent to the, quote, fair market value of unsold properties. So a house you've owned for 10 years, it hasn't been sold, so there's no official actual number for how much it costs. And it looks at all of this different data of unsold properties, as well as data sets with known sale prices, looks at the characteristics of both properties to look for patterns, basically, to see if, okay, this house that you own that you paid whatever for 10 years ago, but that price doesn't mean that much anymore. And what are the characteristics that we have about your house? All these different data points about the number of bathrooms, square feet, neighborhood, et cetera. And if we can find other houses that in all of these respects seem to mirror that house, but it's a house that's been sold in the last year, we can basically train an algorithm to find out the best ways to predict how much that house will sell for by basically finding similarities between it, the kind of patterns that make it similar to other houses. And this was a really different process. Prior algorithms had been much more regressive because they were really clunky. They basically assigned average values to characteristics and then used those to evaluate all home prices across the whole Cook County area without kind of regard for other smaller differences, changes in the data, neighborhood differences. So for example, in that kind of really simplistic non-machine learning based model, really small differences can dramatically affect the market value. But if you basically just say, oh, well, a house here has 2 bedrooms and 2 baths, say, and one house like that might sell for $300,000. And now another one also has 2 bedrooms and 2 baths, but sells for $100,000. Traditional mass appraisal models would just give an average of those two and basically say for any house with those characteristics, the value would be $200,000, which obviously would be too low for one of them, too high for the other. So the idea of using this more sophisticated machine learning technique was to be able to generate multiple different models that would then be able to test whether one model was more appropriate to one neighborhood rather than another, whether one kind of set of shared characteristics were predictive in one smaller area rather than another. So the idea is that one could be more granular, more sensitive to all kinds of variations, neighborhood and geography being only one of them. Of course, this depends deeply on what's in the data, the quality of the data, what kind of attributes are in there, what might be missing from the data. And this is something that the assessor's office is really concerned with, has spent a lot of time kind of trying to get new sources, recognizing which data points are either not predictive or potentially biased or discriminatory, characteristics like site desirability that are really abstract and subjective. Don't refer to something like square feet, which is a more objective measure. I'm actually, just for the sake of time, going to skip over this, but kind of explaining the different, the ways that data sets are broken apart in order to train a machine learning algorithm. Don't worry about this for now. It's not going to affect your ability to understand this, this case study. So here, for example, is a list of different features that are used in the data to train the machine learning algorithms. From the age of the house, central air conditioning, apartments, attic finish, etc. Not going to read through all of them, and this actually doesn't cover all of them, but different kinds of data points with some of them numeric, some of them categorical data points that are basically, used in order to train these systems. Okay, and then all of this is tested according to different metrics of fairness. And these are, dispersal, numerical categories like the coefficient of dispersal I showed earlier. I'll skip this slide too, actually, don't worry about that. What I want to get to, though, is ultimately, so what they were trying to do was build the system, and it's been pretty successful so far, though it's still in its early stages. What I want to draw attention to are the notions of justice and justice as fairness that are being employed, pointing to both some of the ways in which they're effective in this particular case, some areas in which perhaps they don't fully live up to their mandate, and also some ways in which this is still a relatively narrow and partial notion of what justice and justice is fairness is. So there's a kind of, in the title of this slide, I have a sort of chain of rough equivalences that's fairly common in the world of algorithmic justice that equates justice with something called fairness. And fairness itself is a kind of accuracy, and accuracy here as predictive power. Does it accurately predict something? Is this done uniformly? So predictive power, fairness also as uniformity, and also as impartiality. It's done the same for everybody. It's done without being partial or trying to correct for anything by seeing one group of people differently rather than the other. Treats every data point more or less the same. This is another way of saying that fairness is being figured as algorithmic. That the most fair way to do this is quantitative, it's formal, it's objective, it's accurate, predictive, and impartial. And that's contrasted in part with a public appeals process that has human checks built in, that there's humans in the loop. This is an idea that has worked fairly powerfully in certain respects for Cook County. At the same time, it's one that we'll see throughout this course also works quite the opposite way. It's often used in order to take supposedly subjective humans out of the loop precisely where they're able to make checks for things. And part of the power actually of this, this articulation, this vision of algorithmic justice is the appeal, to transparency here. Transparency is supposed to mean that everyone can see and access the data. It's not, you don't have to go through a certain narrow, go through experts, that is tax lawyers, in order to understand what's happening and to actually change things. So in some ways, it's not about getting rid of humans in the loop, but integrating them potentially in a somewhat different way. So in part, what I'm also trying to do is center the role of the human and the social in and around the algorithm, that even whenever algorithmic justice is instantiated, articulated, built into systems, it always works because of the way it's connected to the human and to the social that actually instantiate and carry out these algorithms. And the reason, the way that they function is very much, well, the way they function is a function of those structures. And we need to think about them when actually talking and discussing the types of justice that are or not achieved in any given case. So a couple issues. I've talked about this, about the new open data system in Cook County in fairly positive terms so far. But there are certainly issues, and one is just simply being overly taken with the notion that algorithmic fairness as quantitative, informal, and objective will actually fix these problems. So for instance, here the idea is because it's open, it's easy for everyone to challenge. The metrics for what counts as fairness are so easy to see that those appeal boards won't be able to reject, won't be able to sort of change people's assessments as readily, because there'll be so much evidence that actually these appeals are fair because these models show that they are. So the idea is that it will challenge that review board and basically make the burden higher for overturning an assessment. One issue, of course, is that the more complex, the more predictive the model gets, the more complex it does. And the more difficult it actually becomes to explain to the everyday person in the public how the model actually works. So in the long term, there's of course concerns that the public won't necessarily be able to use these tools to easily go and be like, hey, I've been overassessed. Please, change the, change it. Look, I can point to the system that's online. It actually, and we've interviewed both one of students on our student team and myself have interviewed the chief data scientist at Cook County and asked about this. And his response to this, like, aren't you worried about losing explainability, undermining the function of your appeal to transparency? And his response very much was like, well, I'm an expert in this and I should be trusted that the models I'm building are correct and trustworthy and accurate. So again, that begins to undermine transparency. It means that community engagement in actually maintaining this system is put off, and a kind of technocratic system that says this is objective and fair, just look at the numbers, they're all there and they're public, kind of undermines this appeal to transparency. And other issues potentially crop up around transparency as a version of justice. When again, you think that transparent, is transparent to everyone in the same way. But again, those with additional resources to pay for experts to help them make challenges, might still allow those with those resources to game the system. They can see how the model works. Maybe they'll have more sophisticated ways of exploiting loopholes in the code. And then finally, just to end, is to get you to think about what forms of justice does this approach leave out? In many respects, right, this doesn't solve any problems of disparity in income, disparity in housing property, the way in which certain neighborhoods, because they're Black neighborhoods, have systematically lower property values in the first place. So it doesn't address, of course, all kinds of inequality. It's a kind of stopgap. It fixes one kind of problem, but one that already exists in a particularly unjust system that dates back to this history of redlining in Chicago that we'll actually look at later on in this course. And other questions, of course, is what they're predicting is the fair market value. This gets at the point I was just making. Is the fair market value itself truly, fair? It's fair for the market, but it presupposes that markets themselves are fair means of allocating values and prices around a district. So again, there's a certain notion of fairness that's algorithmic, that's formal, that's market-based in certain respects, but for the very same reasons potentially might be quite limited. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Professor Benny-Glipson.
I see, Daniel, you have your hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just had a short question. How can they make the algorithm fair if the data that they're training on might not be fair?
Right, so it's a great question. So there's different ways of talking about fairness there. So the data could be fair in the sense that the data is totally accurate, but the reality it depicts is not necessarily a fair reality. So that's one level. And so the best, and that's one of the points I'm trying to make, an algorithm that is perfectly predictive is predictive of market value, and market value might not be fair. So that's one aspect. The other is, right, the data itself might be not fair, but biased, in that there's more missing data from some areas. Say that they have less data on older homes that are in low-income areas that haven't been remodeled as recently. For example, remodeling is what increases house values, and that often isn't data that's reflected in the data sets. Remodels are more likely to take place in wealthy areas. So this is precisely an issue, and it's one they're concerned about. So they're actively trying to get more data on things like remodeling, using other third-party sources for data about houses that wasn't initially collected by the assessor's office in the first place, using things like, you know, Zillow, online, you know, real estate to databases in order to try to get more granularity, precisely because of this, that those updates which make other houses more valuable than they appear at first glance is often missing. And that's part of what makes the data unfair. So that is, you can't make a fair assessment if you don't have a relatively granular data, but it increases the imperative for, you know, you to share data, increases the, you know, reasons why people might try to hide some of this data about their houses from being collected and accessible if they know that it could lead to higher assessments. So it's a fantastic question.
So is the integrity check step that was in the flowchart somehow trying to fix it, or just making sure that there are like no wrong data included?
The integrity check in that step, I'm not off the top of my head don't remember which. I mean, there's various different kinds of integrity checks and lots of different ways of trying to check themselves, lots of different steps and places where they do that. I'm not sure which step that was. Again, if you're really interested in this particular case study, I would encourage you just to go to their GitLab and look around. They have a lot of, it's, again, one of the difficulties, there's so much there, and they're constantly, actually, even since we started looking at this case a year ago, they've changed and updated the website, the GitLab a lot. So it's not always clear what you're looking at is the most recent. Finding the right stuff is a little bit difficult, but I'm certainly, you know, would encourage you to go poke around and take a look. And I have some of the links to both the stories and the GitLabs in these slides. And so yeah, Janet's mentioning, you know, assessor's office has to collect data to help assess, and they send people out to do site visits, but they don't go inside the homes. So there's a lot that they often are missing, or they have to extrapolate based on things that they're seeing from the outside that are really important too. Okay.
Could you, I think if you stop sharing, then I can.
Yes.